Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here and welcome to the Town of Loomis Rural Street Technical Assistance Program Report Out. My name is Mary Beth Van Boris. I'm the Town of Loomis Planning Director. And I see on this call we also have our newest elected officials, Jenny Nisley and Danny Cartwright. Just trying to, people are...
Yay! Congratulations.
I'm trying to see if there's any others that I need to acknowledge here. But anyway, as you may be aware, this program is kind of a recap. It's in conjunction with the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, Michele Reeves from Civilis Consultants, and town staff. We conducted 3 workshops, September 30th, October 1st, and October 7th. And this meeting, those meetings were very fun, thought-provoking, and everything leading to our town story of today. And the information gained from those 3 workshops is what Michele will be presenting this evening. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Greg Chu from Sacramento Area Council of Governments. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Mary Beth. Again, Greg Chu with the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, or SACOG is our acronym. We serve as the 6-county regional transportation planning agency for the Sacramento region. We work in conjunction with Placer County and the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency as well. What we have tonight is this effort is the result of a grant that Caltrans gave to SACOG, and we're passing down to the town to provide an opportunity to talk about visioning for Loomis and ways that it can look at its core area. And so we've hired Michele Reeves with Civilis Consulting out of Portland, Oregon. She's done work here in Loomis. And more importantly, she really has a good understanding both rural communities and suburban communities. She works across the country on community development and economic revitalization. So tonight, she's going to wrap up her work and talk about information that she has from consulting. So before I turn it over to Michele, I just want to, in case there's additional representatives, Mike Lucan from the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency may be here tonight. I don't see him yet. And also James Corliss, the head of my organization, SACOG, is also potentially here tonight. So anyway, with that, I'll turn it over to Michele Reeves with Civilis.
Hello. Well, I'm excited to be here and to see everybody kind of late at night. Reminder for everyone to mute their microphones. And I am just going to go into screen share here right away. And we're going to just test and make sure. And I'm just going to tell you, Greg, Chu, you're the first one who happens to come up on my video. If for some reason, because my headphones with the microphone has started to not work so well. So if all of a sudden it's not working, you know, hop on and give me the wave off and I'll put in my wired, less cool headphones. All right, and then my next question is are these slides moving for people? Did that, okay, gratitude. So thanks to Greg, to Sean, to Greg and SACOG for sponsoring, Sean, Mary Beth, Carol, everyone who worked so hard to put all this together and organize everything. Anders and Christy, and we're all gonna stay for the Q&A at the end. So Anders and Christy are gonna be working on your general plan update. So thanks to them for all of their work. Local Government Commission is on the call. They're gonna be doing some follow-on work with you guys around transportation planning. And Robert Liberty is on the call. He had a Santa hat on earlier, so that may be a way to identify him. He is going to be working with you guys on some housing work going forward. So I just want to thank everyone, big family that's working on this together, and then all of you for coming today and also participating in the interviews, the workshops, and the surveys. I am really honored to be back in Loomis today. I wish it was in person, but it's virtual. And we're going to kind of dive right in. I like to start all my presentations in case, even though I've presented to you guys a fair amount now, I always like to start with a little bit of a disclaimer that I break a lot of the rules of public speaking. So I talk really fast and I cover way too much material for the time given me. And today is going to be no exception. So I would like for people to hop into their Zoom window and hit the chat button at the bottom. As I'm talking, if a question comes up that you want us to cover in the Q&A, it'd be fantastic to pop it into the chat. And I'm going to ask you right now to guess in the chat how many slides are in my slide presentation. And I'm going to have Greg unmute and tell me what's the highest number that's come up.
So far, 100.
Okay, you're way off. Somebody's got to guess higher.
99 and 98. So they seem to be thinking it's, we got 125. We got 125.
All right, so 261 slides. And here's the thing, I guarantee you guys, it's not going to feel like it. So without further ado, see, we have a lot to cover. I'm going to jump into what we're going to talk about today. And by and large, we're going to spend most of our time on the story framework, but we're going to touch on these 3 other areas. And I'm going to start because we have a lot to cover. And this is a little bit of a detour where I'm going to actually talk about myself, which is not something that I usually do. But one of the biggest tensions that existed throughout the story framework for you guys was this sort of urban-rural divide. And there was a whole lot of, we don't want any big city Bay Area folks coming and telling us what to do. So before we dive into this presentation, I just wanted to dispel any notions that I don't understand rural communities. And I'm going to do that in 2 ways. First, I'm going to do it personally. So I grew up in rural Oregon in a community of loggers and fishermen and dairy farmers. And, you know, honestly, these were communities that were devastated because of the reduction in fishing and logging that comes with the depletion of forests and fisheries. So this is me right there in junior high in our 4th of July parade, which you can tell is not horribly warm in Oregon. And I got roped in kind of literally and figuratively to throw candy out of the back of a truck. So I get rural. Growing up in my hometown, you could call to 3 different cities in a local call with just 5 digits in your phone number. And that was not in 1900, that was in 1970s and 80s. And a lot of people like to say, well, you know, my parents never locked their front door. Well, my parents never locked their front door, but they also didn't even have a lock on the front door until sometime after I graduated from college. So they couldn't even lock their front door if they wanted to. And we used to heat our house with a wood stove. And I don't mean in that romantic wood burning fireplace kind of way. I mean in there was a giant storm. And so we took our really old truck that looked a lot like that, but had a winch on the back up into loggy roads and pulled trees off of hills, sawed them into rounds, put them in the flatbed truck, drove home. And one of our chores growing up was splitting wood. And the power went out where I lived a lot and very frequently. So the wood stove was very useful if the power was out for multiple days to be able to cook. So I personally understand a rural experience probably to a greater degree than most people do that are my age. Secondly, I have structured my entire business in order to be able to bring resources to rural communities like the one that I grew up in. So this, I've done a lot of work in Northeast or Northwest Nevada and rural Nevada. So this is on the drive from Reno out to Elko. It's just so beautiful. So I've worked in Elko, Nevada, which is home of the, I think I accidentally drew on my screen. That's gonna drive me nuts. Did I draw on my screen? Robert, I'm gonna make you unmute.
Yes.
If there is a little mark on your screen.
How do I get rid of that? Here. Clear? Clear all drop, boom.
There it is.
Look at me. I'm like an advanced, I'm like a Zoom newbie and then an advanced Zoom user all at once. So somebody in the presentations, I just did it again. Get out of annotate. There we go. Okay. So somebody in the surveys had mentioned a small town that they kind of liked being Dyersville, Iowa. And I actually worked there, which is the home of Field of Dreams. And I worked there, it was the last trip I took this year before COVID hit. And they have not only a baseball thing, but they have a really big historic cathedral in their small downtown, which is kind of cool. And I've worked in ag towns like in central Michigan, like this one called Charlotte, Michigan. So I both personally and professionally are really interested in the best practices for rural communities. And I've structured my entire professional life around bringing best practices to small towns and to help people like Loomis. So that's what I bring to the table. And I just wanted to talk about that sort of before we dive into the findings and the recommendations that are in this report. So the next section is changes. I'm not going to sing to you. And in this one, I like to really revisit. When I come back to a community, I like to look at the things that have changed since I was there last time. So it's been almost exactly 3 years since I was in town, and that's me way in the background there, and we're in the Blue Goose. And I wanted to just kind of go over the things that have changed, and I'm looking for things to have changed for the better, which I'm happy to report that you guys have a ton of stuff going on. So from the time that I was last there, you funded and successfully implemented and had a fully subscribed facade improvement program, which is fantastic. You had long vacant properties get improved and tenanted with businesses that people already consider to be beloved. And side note, the head chef of Reds is a Del Oro graduate, which I think is fantastic. And to help facilitate this, your town council actually went back and refunded the facade improvement program to continue to bring these kinds of resources to buildings like this. You have Leeds and Leicester coming soon, opening up next to Reds. This story of how the Loomis Basin Brewery took over the subway and not only made it look way better, but pivoted to doing essential market goods that you couldn't get during the pandemic. I wish I could take one of those little Microsoft paintbrush tools and just around the entire country, just do this so that this is what all the subways would look like afterwards. So really, really fantastic work. You have another long-term vacancy in town that has received its clearances to move forward, and construction, I hear, actually started on this project last week. You have a planned restaurant operation on the way on this site, and the building's been torn down in preparation. You guys had a hardware store, a really cool and charming hardware store open in the middle of your town during a pandemic. And by the way, opened by a Del Oro graduate, and also fantastic cross-pollination. So they're featuring local mandarins, which is really wonderful. And this is going to sound like the hardware store sponsored this presentation, but I love this. They have a partnership with Gander Tap House, and if you buy a growler at Ace, you get a discount when you fill it up the first time at the Tap House. So great cross-pollination. The third phase of Taylor Road improvements that brought new pedestrian and bicycle facilities was finished on the street, and you have a mixed-use project that's going in near Sierra College Boulevard, and they've done the grading and completed streets and sidewalks, and then when they clear winter, they're going to dive in and finish this project. So that is an amazing amount of things, and that's probably a subset of things, but these are the things that jumped out at me that have been happening in Loomis since I was there. So not only is that wonderful news, it also highlights something super important about human systems, about living systems. Any system that has life in it, a reef, a rainforest, a beehive, a city, is constantly and always changing. You cannot have a living system that doesn't change. And not only does it change, but oftentimes that change is involuntary. Like these poor bees who put away all this honey, and then my parents hauled out the frames. They weren't planning on that happening in their system. So I want to talk about some of the involuntary changes in small communities that can have really big impacts. So the fires that happened around Ojai, California depressed tourism only for about a year to a year and a half. But that depression in tourism took out this business that had been around for about 75 years. So change happens whether you want it to or not. And sometimes it's big and sometimes it's involuntary. In Bisbee, Arizona, whose entire economy was dependent upon this large mine next door, when the mine closed, they had to reimagine their entire town from the ground up in order to survive economically. Or take the town of Wells, Nevada, which is a bedroom community of Elko, Nevada. So it's on the extreme northwest corner of Nevada. And they had this beautiful little run of Main Street infrastructure that all fell down in a freak earthquake. And so overnight, they all of a sudden were in the business of deconstructing building and selling used bricks. So you never know what kind of change is going to happen. You cannot stop change. Your goal as a community is to think about how to plan for and manage change. So that is the end of changes, and I'm kind of speeding through this because we got to dive into the story framework. What did we learn about Loomis in all of the work that we did together as a community. So this is the framework that we use, and this is the same framework that improvisation artists use to create compelling stories on the fly. And I find it's a much more useful way for looking at cities than typical planning frameworks. And so these are the 4 elements of any successful story. And the first one is characterization, and this is your physical story, and this is the easiest thing to probably understand. And so this is a small community I'm going to reference in this presentation in Oregon called Canby, and it is just outside the edge of the urban growth boundary in the greater Portland metro area. So it has some real analogies to Loomis. And you can see these are pictures from their small town downtown. And it wouldn't surprise you that their tagline is the garden spot. So do you think that physically they're telling that story? That's characterization, that's your physical story. So I want to talk about some of the findings that we found out about the physical story in Loomis. And one of the first things that I do is ask a series of questions. So I just want to know what words describe Loomis in the past, present, and future. So I pop the answers to all of those into word clouds. And word clouds show the bigger words are the words that are said more frequently, and the smaller the word, those are the words that are said less frequently. And so here is the word cloud for what words describe Loomis in the past. And we did workshops, we held interviews, and we had over 500 people answer these very difficult open-ended surveys that took quite a bit of time. So people really devoted a lot of time to these. So what words describe Loomis in the past? I want you to look at this set of words because they're going to look really familiar. So I asked the same question. So the themes here: rural, cares about family, cares about being friendly. Fruit is on there, small town, community. That's particularly surprising. So what words describe Loomis in the present? Really kind of the only change is that fruit went away, and but small town, family, community friendly is still really sort of front and center. And then after that, little bit of a mix, but not a clear sense of a change from the past. And then when I asked what words do you want to describe Loomis in the future, we have the same set of words: small town, friendly, community, family. Downtown jumped in there a little bit. So it's kind of interesting. I've done this process all over the country for all kinds of different communities, and I have never had essentially the same word cloud for the past, present, and future happen for a community, which I thought was kind of interesting, and I think indicates how hard it is sometimes to talk about change and about how things might have been different in the past from today, or how things might be different in the future from today. That is something that your community is not super comfortable talking about right now. So I want to dive into the past a little bit more. I was actually surprised that the word agriculture was not a much bigger word, because that was a real, linchpin of your whole. So fruit was a kind of medium, tiny word. But really that words around the agricultural economy, which was really dominant for you guys in the past. I would say your community was more affordable and more blue collar in the past, and you had a different business mix downtown in the past than you did today. So those are all things that came out of workshops and interviews and individually reading through all of the surveys. One of the most interesting findings about the past actually came from one of your community elders in a workshop who went to elementary school prior to World War II in Loomis. And he said that the elementary school was a majority minority community, with the vast bulk of students and his classmates being made up of the Japanese and Chinese communities, with whites making up maybe about 30% of the elementary school. And the impact that the internship camps, for instance, had on the enrollment in the school was really, really interesting. So that is that's a really big change for Loomis to go, regionally, to have the school go from being a majority minority community to being majority white. Those are big differences from the past that were not really mentioned or didn't really float up kind of in the surveys. To get at a little bit more of a deeper dive into what you guys might want for the future, what I did was take this word cloud and I just stripped out what were the biggest words. So small town, friendly, community, and family. I just took those words out and I wanted to see what popped up and came to the surface. So I removed the biggest words, and here is the resulting word cloud. So you can see there's a lot more parity between the rest of the words, and there are a lot of new and different words. So diverse and progressive popped up. And people really talked about wanting it to be fun and vibrant, and wanting restaurants, wanting it to be unique. And then some of the same things, wanting, you know, it to be quaint, caring about the schools, wanting it to be welcoming and neighborly. That all ties into that idea of community spirit. So I would say that the themes for your physical story that come out of this, definitely small town vibe, very important, rural and agriculture, and more vibrancy. So let's talk about some recommendations. Like, what does that actually mean if you were going to concretely try and do that? And I'm going to mostly frame recommendations either around policy or planning initiatives or around you know, kind of downtown improvement and economic development initiatives. So if we take this list, let's look first at small town vibe. And I like to really think about, like, what are the building blocks of making a small town vibe, the kinds of places that you guys said in the survey you like and are interested in. And what I like to do is look at what actually was a successful small town in 1900 and is still a successful small town ag town today, because I don't want to reinvent the wheel. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So let's look at that. So here is a picture of a successful ag town that was incorporated before 1900. And so let's look at what the elements are to that original traditional small town. Typically, there's an ease of circulation and getting around, and that usually takes the form of a grid. It may be fairly linear district with a small amount of grid off of it, but usually in these old, smaller towns that were successful and have continued to be successful, there's some form of a small grid. The second thing you see is a mix of uses in a tight area. So in this one, you can see there are ag industrial buildings here. There's a Main Street commercial district here. And I want you to note this Main Street commercial district, those might have residential spaces upstairs, they might not. They might just be one-story buildings. They're typically going to be between 1- and 3-story buildings. And this particular Main Street district, the reason I know that it's going to have the ability to be successful is because the buildings are built right next to each other, right up to the sidewalk, because that's the kind of cross-pollination between businesses that you need for a successful Main Street small town commercial district. And then you have residential uses right adjacent to both of those. And again, they may be a mix of sizes. And then the last characteristic of successful small towns that still have the small town vibe is there's a very clean edge between where the town is and where the rural agricultural uses start. So where is this community? Can anybody tell me? Does anybody know? Does anybody want to guess on chat? And Greg, I hate going between screen share and chat because sometimes it glitches and it pops me out. So Greg, let me know if anybody can guess.
So we got Oregon and Davis.
No. So I'm going to give you a hint. It's in your region.
Loomis.
No. Yolo County.
Lincoln. Woodland.
Well, we're getting closer because it starts with a W.
West Sac. Winters.
Winters. Yay.
Winters.
So it's Winters. And there are some of their fruit sheds there to the right that were renovated. So Winters was incorporated in 1898. And those were all pictures from Winters, California, which was a very successful ag town incorporated in the 1900s and is successful today. So let's look at some more characterization recommendations, but a little bit more for the private realm and kind of the downtown realm. Rural agriculture, how do we show that in our story and in a way that helps commerce and helps industrial production that happens around agricultural towns? And for this, I want to use, I like to work in examples instead of giving you lists. And so for this one, I want to use the example of Point Reyes Station, which for hundreds of years has been dairy farming country. So this is Point Reyes. And I love that there's just a horse on the side of the building here by the bookstore. And in their little downtown, they have a creamery. So this is dairy farm country. So they actually have manufacturing production facility creamery right in their downtown for a nationally recognized cheese brand. So fantastic use for an ag downtown to have making of value-added products happening in the downtown. And this is their showroom. They have a small grocery store. They do not have a Raley's. And the first time I went into that grocery store, I was back by a very nondescript meat counter. And it was during like middle of the week, mostly locals coming in, and everyone was coming back to the meat counter and getting soft serve ice cream. And I thought it was really strange because I've never wanted to buy soft serve ice cream from you know, and pork chops at the same time. So I thought this is kind of a weird adjacency. Why are all these people buying soft serve ice cream? But I'm like, since they are, they must know something. So we're going to buy some ice cream. And we did. And it turned out to be the best soft serve ice cream that I've ever had. And it was made with water buffalo milk. And again, that's reflecting like very unique circumstances of specialty dairy production that happens in their region being made into a product that is really one of the best things I've ever tasted in the world, just for sale in the back of their grocery store. So the innovative agricultural things that are happening around this community are expressed in every possible way throughout the town. In the middle of downtown, they have a little honor system food stand, and that is supplied by some young people who do micro farming on residential land that is not being used for anything in particular. So they've approached some different homeowners and said, could we take a ½ acre of your land and put it into production and sell food locally? So there's some really interesting micro farming things happening around this community. And then just like your hardware store is doing, all of these food uses are cross-pollinating between each other and using each other's products in each other's businesses and promoting each other, both for tourism, both for people to be visiting and to just be able to consume when you're in the community. So that's a way to express agriculture in the private sector realm. Now I want to talk about a really specific business example from Winters. This is a restaurant and bar called Preserve, and it was founded and started by a local been in the community generation farm family. And they created this really amazing restaurant, and they use farm implements to create the lampshades. So I think those are tractor wheel rims. And they use the packing crates for produce to do storage and to create displays. They have a beautiful outdoor seating area, but it's also a food production area where they make they dry and preserve a lot of their own products that are not only used in the restaurant, but you can buy for sale, and they cure their own meats. And you can see that happening through the window while you're in the restaurant. Those are all great examples of creating physical story around agriculture that interconnects with all of the things that are happening in the greater region around Winters. So the last thing I want to touch on very quickly for physical story is vibrancy. People wanted to see more vibrancy when we talked about like, what are things you want to see in the future? And that's usually expressed in downtown. So I'm just going to do a very quick review of some of the things that we talked about when I was there last time. In your downtown, color is the cheapest and easiest way to bring vibrancy to your downtown. So I'm going to give you an example. This is Madras, Oregon. It's Central Oregon, similar population to Loomis. And does this art gallery look like it sells like really high-end, fantastic art of every kind of, you know, they sell tapestries, they sell mosaics, they sell sculpture, they sell paintings, they sell baskets, like books, everything you can imagine. Do you get any sense like really high quality art comes out of this building? Probably not. And do you want to introduce color on your building with a giant awning? No, that's not the way to do it. So they did a fantastic facade renovation of this building. They created a high parapet. They used one of the local artists to introduce color through mosaic work and to actually show that there is interesting stuff going on. So great example of color. Let's talk about transparency now. So although this was a great facade renovation, I still can't see inside, and that's a problem. So we want to talk about balancing the light levels inside and outside with your windows, and we want to talk about not putting in super dark windows into your commercial spaces on the ground floor. So what we did with this space is we installed track lighting immediately inside the window. You need one head every 1 to 1.5 feet. You got to position it so it shines just back inside the window, not out onto the sidewalk. And you need the right bulbs. I don't want anybody to ever put a compact fluorescent bulb, and that's the one with the twistiness on it. And this is one that you see in this picture that has been disguised to look like a commercial bulb with a parabolic face, but it's not. No compact fluorescent on your fixtures in the windows. If you do these things, then your windows can go from this to this. So you can still see the ladder in the background. So the night before we were doing this project, we went in and just did a quick light install, and we just did a very quick temporary display to see how it would look. And the next morning at like 7:30 a.m. when we started, there were people with their nose pressed to the glass of the window, checking out what was going on because the windows were now transparent. Has a huge impact on the idea of vibrancy in town. And then of course, people, outdoor seating areas, people walking around, things to interact with outside. Those are all ways in which you introduce physical vibrancy into the characterization part of your story. So that is the easiest part of story. It's the tangible part of story. It's the part of story that we all understand. The rest of these, objective, relationship, and environment, are a little bit trickier, and they really get into the meat of who we are as communities. So we're going to dive into them one by one, and I'm going to start with objective. So objective in story is really the heart of story. It's what motivates a character. And in a place or a community, objective is like what you stand for, what experiences do you want visitors to have, and why would somebody connect with your town or your district or your downtown. Those are the things we want to understand through objective. So I'm going to start with some of the findings that we got. I asked you guys, what are folks in Loomis passionate about? And I want you to notice that this is almost the exact same word cloud as the first three. You guys really kind of went on, it was like a political interview on TV. You just kept answering the same question that you wanted to answer, not necessarily the question that was at the table. So I had to keep stripping out these same words of small town, community, family to find out what was some of that stuff underneath. But there are new words that came here that were bigger, and the two are schools and sports. So you guys are definitely passionate about your school, and I would say Del Oro is probably the most unifying thing in your community, and then sports. The next question that I asked was, is there anywhere that you've been that offers an experience that you would like Loomis to offer? And I want to be clear, I was not saying, is there a community you want to copy, or is there a community that you want Loomis to become? That's not what we're talking about. But is there somewhere that you've been that offers an experience that you would like Loomis to offer in the future, some element of that? So again, I had to strip out the words small town, community, those big ones that came, to see what was that next layer of stuff, to peel back the onion on that. And downtown was one of the biggest words. And that's not surprising, because a downtown is a distillation of everything we are as a community and what we stand for. So when people think about what is a place that offers an experience, the way that you dip your toe in a community and you'll understand what it's about partially is by visiting their downtown. So it's not a surprise that people focused on that. Definitely some new words here: walkable, walking, seeing more shops, having more restaurants. Those are all things, but maintaining rural. People liked old town feels. They wanted to have some history, and that focus on a mix of businesses in the downtown. So those were all things that came out of what kind of experience would you like Loomis to possibly offer in the future. So that really informs, again, downtown execution is something that I think people are pretty passionate about having change. So the last question that I asked about objective was probably my favorite question in the story framework. And it's, if Loomis was a person, what is that person feeling right now? And I said in the surveys, hey, if you need to describe that person to me, I want you to feel free to do that too. So if Loomis was a person, what is that person feeling right now? And I wanted to share with you some of the answers that people gave about Loomis, and I'm not going to read them to you, although I may read snippets from here and there. So if Loomis was a person, these are some of the answers, and you're going to notice there's a really wide variety. If Loomis was a person, so we had two people here. The one on the left answered that they were old, and the one on the right answered that they were young. I thought was interesting. And it's very, very evocative, right? Still a little immature, quickly growing to the person they were meant to be, indicating that, maybe Loomis is in a little bit of a time of change. If Loomis was a person, so these are very evocative. Feels like young people are too entitled and should get off my lawn. And then I have to say, the second one here on the right really did crack me up. People love him, but they don't want him to help decorating their home. Let's read that a little bit. If Loomis was a person, so here we have, three very different answers: an old farmer, an educated young mother, and a couple who've been together for a long time. And all of these represent facets of you guys as a community. They're really, I really appreciated the time and the effort that people went to think about these and to answer these questions. So for me, one of the themes that came out of objective in that last question is that idea of defining, like, who are we as a community for Loomis. That is something that you're at the beginning of that journey, and it's something that I think is a little bit hard, and you have people who have very different feelings and ideas about what that means. It's kind of interesting. If I had asked the question, who do you not want to be? Everyone could have answered that really, really easily. And the top two answers probably would have been Rockland and Roseville. And the next one would have been Bay Area or San Francisco. So it's really easy sometimes to say what you don't want to be. And it's not a surprise that it's hard to say, who do we want to be? So I don't want you to feel bad about that, because you guys are a new city. You're at the beginning of that journey. Winters has been thinking about that since 1898 when they were incorporated. So what are some of the recommendations that come out of objectives? So let's just look at these things. School. The school is the one unifying thing in your community that everybody's passionate about and really loves. Your newspaper has been consolidated. Reporters have been cut. You don't have as much local news happening. You should really look towards your student reporters and have them publish stories in the Loomis News and in the school paper and cover things like business openings and city council meetings, and really interact and connect with your student reporters and making them, you know, integrate more into the daily workings of the community. You know, I think about this all the time. It was college, but I went to school at the University of Texas at Austin. And, you know, that was before newspapers had completely died. But what was interesting is the Daily Texan in Austin was a more well-read newspaper than the Austin American Statesman. It was a really well-respected newspaper in the community. You could really look to maybe partnering with Davis and other colleges and creating interesting micro farm programs around within Loomis, and thinking about how you guys are continuing to be passionate about and contribute to the farm to fork movement. You can work with your student makers to create things like, if you have a shop class, to make bike racks for downtown or those kinds of things. And do not underestimate what students can do. Up in Twist, Washington, which is in north central Washington, town of 900, they took over this former ranger station. They created a careers and construction academy in that building to the right. And those students repurposed this building, which turned into a bag manufacturing facility. So do not underestimate the ways in which your student community can really be contributing to your entire town. And that is something that definitely would bring your community together. Sports. So everyone said, like, we love sports in all the interviews. And so I asked, I was like, so, oh, that's cool. Like, do you have adult sports leagues? You know, do adults play sports? And they're like, oh, no. That's just kids. And some of the people in the surveys really talked about how cool it would be to have more of a year-round community sports complex that really tied the whole community together. And I thought it was really interesting that they said it is perhaps the single thing we could do to improve our community and bring us together during these times. And I also learned something, because they said that Vermont sends the most athletes per capita to the Olympics, and Vermont is very passionate about year-round non-tryout sports leagues. So I think that idea of community sports complex that's not just focused on kids, but also adults is an interesting long-term goal. But in the meantime, you could think about how you might be able to have fun, family-friendly outdoor sports leagues. You can have outdoor chess, outdoor Connect 4 that you would do downtown. This is a temporary miniature golf installation with a beer cart next to it. So there are a lot of fun things that you could have in terms of sort of adult recreation sports leagues to start to build connection within the community. Downtown execution, big theme when people were talking about places that offered a small town experience that they thought they would like Loomis to offer. So if we go back to our original vibrancy list, we could add two things. Things that make it more walkable and active tenants. People want to see businesses on the ground floor they can interact with. They don't have to all be retail, but they need to be things that they can interact with and that are going to enliven and make the street interesting. So that question, if downtown was a person, you know, what is it feeling right now? We asked that question about Loomis, but if you're going to evaluate how your downtown is doing, you want to ask yourself that same question about downtown, because the answers are the ways that visitors feel. So if you ask that question about your downtown and people answer it with words like sad or tired or needs a facelift or those kinds of things, then that's how people feel when they visit the district, and it impacts sales. So you can use that question to evaluate how you're doing downtown over time. The last recommendation out of the objective section of the story framework is around that idea of who are we? Who are we as a community? And I just want to remind you guys, you are new to this. You are a newly incorporated community, and you were incorporated defensively. So generally, people who lived in unincorporated county, they do so on purpose because they don't want to be involved in a bunch of the kinds of activities and the sorts of intensity of activities that happen to self-govern in a city environment. So when you're a new place that has just incorporated, it's much easier to think about what you don't want to be than to do all the work that goes into creating some of that kind of sort of civic DNA. And I want to first just touch on the fact that I think that incorporating is a really good idea. And I want to share two stories from Yolo County to highlight that. And actually, Local Government Commission, who's on the call and going to be doing some work with you, they were working with me on this project, and we were going in and helping Esparto and Winters. And I was completely astonished when people told me that Esparto, which you're seeing the pictures of here, was actually pretty much the same as Winters, they said. You know, turn of the century, maybe up to kind of World War II-ish. So here's Winters. Do these look like remotely the same communities? They do not. And so you have to ask yourself, what is the difference? If Esparto and Winters were very similar, turn of the century, and they're very different now, you know, why did Winters make it through, and why did Esparto not make it through? And I have to wonder if part of it is because Winters just happened to be incorporated, and that meant that they built a real civic DNA, this identity around who they wanted to be, and an ability to talk about these things and plan for the future. I really credit Cecilia, their longtime mayor, who's now an assemblywoman, for a lot of this work in the modern era in the last couple of decades. And I asked her, like, why do you think Winters was able to really shift and to ride through these changes in a positive way? So this is my personal belief. This is not what she said, but she was a master at bringing resources to her community throughout the region, like with SACOG, constantly interconnecting with everyone in the region to bring people, money, expertise, whatever it was. She brought it to Winters and used it as a basis to get together and talk about their community all the time. She actually singled out to me how important the dinners that the Local Government Commission sponsors around the region, where they bring a bunch of people, a bunch of towns right around a similar area. And if somebody is coming into the greater region who knows something that might be valuable to them, they have them come in and give a little speech and have a dinner, and then they all talk about it and share information. And she said that these dinners actually really helps their community to have these conversations about who they want to be and make smart planning decisions for their community. And I want to stress, these are things that are ongoing. You will never be done with this work. You have to constantly be thinking about who you are and who you want to be, and you have to do it long before you're weighing in on specific projects and plans. I love tours. A lot of people mentioned Nevada City, Grass Valley, Auburn. You could go to Winters. Think about the people that you could talk to in those communities and learn from. Get on the fun bus and go out there and talk to them and learn from them. So there are a lot of ways in which you guys can start building that civic identity, and just give yourself a break and recognize that you're really new to this in a lot of ways, doing it in a city form of government and applying the kinds of tools that are accessible to cities that are not accessible to unincorporated towns in counties. So that is the end of objective. And now we're going to move on to relationship in story. And relationship in story is really interesting. We make a lot of decisions in stories, and we learn about communities in stories or about motivations in stories, all sort of subconsciously through relationship. And so when I'm working on relationship in a place, what am I looking for? So I want to know things like, are businesses banding together and cross-pollinating? How do you welcome new residents? Are public sector agencies and nonprofits working together? Are the public and private sectors collaborating? Is there regional collaboration? What are people relating to, and who does and doesn't relate to a place? All of these things are impacting the economic performance and the identity and how people feel in a place, and they're impacting it so dramatically that actually relationship is a big investment metric for me. So I work a lot in private sector real estate, and when I'm helping people decide where to invest, one of the first things that I look at, if it's a small community, is what is the state of all of those relationships I just listed. And if those relationships are broken, my recommendation is generally not to invest. Relationship is so important. And so we're going to look at some of the findings from relationship in this. So I asked some different questions. One of my questions was, who is and who is not relating to Loomis? And there are a lot of really powerful answers in these, and I'm gonna let you guys read them. I have to say that reading through all these, it made me tear up because there's a lot of hard feelings, and I would say relationship is an area you guys are going to need to work on a lot. So here's some good news though. So everyone loves the school. So things that reference the schools, like I love this, right? Like this is a great quote to show how people feel just about the schools in general. So everyone sort of appreciates the kids and really wants to work on making the schools the best they can be. The other good news in my mind in terms of relationship was actually your facade improvement program, because it showed that there was a strong sense of relationship between downtown. I think it stopped, and sorry, this is like a speech test. So one of the things that I really like about facade improvement programs, is everything okay, Robert? Are we thumbs up?
We're okay. Just
okay.
got a little Zoom alert, so keep on keeping on.
Okay. So one of the things about facade programs is I will often go into a community and they will have had a facade improvement program for 15 years and they never use up the money in it ever. And that is a sign that the relationships between property owners, businesses, and downtown are just broken. So the fact that you created one from scratch out of the middle of nowhere and it was fully subscribed and used up really quickly, and your city council and your town manager figured out how to get more and continue this kind of change, that is really a fantastic sign for downtown. And it's often one that I don't see when I work in communities. So super encouraging. But here are some of the challenges. So much tension in relationship in your community right now. So when I asked who relates or who does not relate to Loomis, this was a very common answer. So I picked quotes that represented themes that were really, really common. Any left lane loon. I like the alliteration there. Right, a left lane loon, somebody who wants to destroy the family values of this town. That's strong language. So these are all direct quotes from the surveys. This one made me laugh. So a lot of tension in relationship, right? And so I tried to kind of tease out what those were. And this is the list I came up with. So sort of old timer versus newcomer, small town, big city, older people versus younger people, conservative, liberal, white people of color, owner renter, and then Loomis and Rockland, Roseville, and then everyone from the Bay Area. So that's a lot of tension for a small community to have. So you guys have a very aspirational tagline. A small town is like a big family. Right now, your small town is like kind of a really big dysfunctional family, right? You guys have a lot of tension going on in terms of relationship. And in order to make really big decisions or plan or figure out what your community is going to be and to be able to make good decisions, you guys have to have strong relationships. And so working on relationship is going to be a really big part of figuring out how you can talk productively about community goals without, kind of having a knife fight over a new housing project. So I asked what were beloved businesses in the community, and definitely some real themes that came out of this. I mean, people overwhelmingly really supported these kinds of things in your restaurants: small biz, local business, and businesses that were connected to food. So that is all stuff that you want to use as you're working on marketing, branding, and economic development. There were some things that did not come out in the word clouds that came out in the interviews and surveys that I wanted to talk about. Some people talked a lot about missing the mix of businesses that were in downtown in the past. So the drugstore was a big one, the Saddle being gone, but also that idea that downtown was a place that you could go to get things you need, that it wasn't just, you know, sort of an expensive glass of wine. And I think there's a sense, there was a real sense of excitement as well about the hardware store opening, and people who took the survey right before it opened, they talked about, you know, that it was going to be opened. So there was a little bit of a sense of wanting some of those essential services back. And everyone really loves all the Eggplant Festival and just all of your events and festivals in general. So I think there was real complete agreement about that. So themes for relationships. You guys have a lot of tension in your relationships right now. I would say one of the things you need to be working on is sort of a safe space civic framework for talking about this stuff that feels comfortable and that people can agree with, and that you guys love things to be local. And I think that's great, and that's a great basis to work from. So let's talk about some relationship recommendations that might come out of these three themes. So tension, you guys have to do stuff together. And I think it's interesting, if you look at the first two elements of the story framework, a lot of the recommendations have pieces that involve doing things together. And a lot of people were already recommending things to repair relationship as they were considering other parts of the story framework. In terms of like, who are we, answering these tough questions and building up that civic DNA, I think developing a civic framework for community decisions that is productive and gets away from sort of coded words that are charged for people is going to be important. And that's sort of the last thing I'm going to touch on before I leave today. I like to really think about resiliency in communities as a way of doing that. In terms of local, I think there are a lot of things that's such a fantastic thing to love in your community and want to support. And so I think that it really informs economic development approaches. You need to think about how Loomis, downtown Loomis, becomes the expression of the entire rural and agricultural economy that exists around its edges. You want to think about how you're attracting or growing your own small businesses. And, you know, anything to do with food is love. People connected with it like nothing else. So definitely should inform how you approach economic development moving forward. And it will make people in the community connect better and feel a relationship between each other and between themselves and the community. So the last piece of the story framework is environment, and it's the context for story, and it governs so much of your story. And we demonstrated that when we did the story framework workshops. But the thing that's kind of interesting for place is the context of your story doesn't change, in the sense that you can't pick up Loomis and you know, move it to North Dakota. It is where it is. And so there are a lot of parts of context that you can't control, although there are some that you can. So let's look at some finding. I'm just going to put them all together here, some findings and recommendations around environment. So I asked people to just describe the environment, both in the region and in California. And, you know, beautiful was the word people used for both. And for Loomis, they really talked about it being country and the foothills and rural. And for the state, they talked about it being more diverse and expensive and higher taxes. And growing was an element of both. But there's a lot of crossover, you know, some of the same issues that exist in the rest of California, and some of the same fantastic things that exist in the rest of California both exist in Loomis. Andrews and Christy, who are doing your general plan update, they did some really interesting research into the land use patterns that are within the city limits. And you can see all the green land there are oak woodlands. So you actually have a lot of oak woodlands in your town. So there might be some interesting things to do around that in terms of identity and interconnecting and trails, a whole host of things. And then the kind of tan areas are your agricultural land. So you actually don't have a lot of agricultural land, even though that's a huge part of your identity and of your past economy. You don't have a lot within city limits. And so I think thinking about how you're preserving and connecting to the larger agricultural and rural economy that exists around the city limits is important as well. You guys really talked a lot about not being Roseville or Rockland, and that also speaks to that whole idea of how are you preserving the more rural and agricultural uses that exist around Loomis that are not to the southwest and are not sort of the looming Roseville and Rockland suburban wave. So those are some things that we're going to talk about. Somebody wrote in, you know, she thinks of that whole area around Loomis as the garden bowl of the foothills, and that it could really, you know, farm to fork, it feeds everyone. People are passionate about agriculture. I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at that whole region. And I want you guys to think about how are you connecting with that distributed rural economy in lots of different ways, from planning through to commerce. And the example from the hardware store was a really great example of that. So I think that the themes about valuing your nearby rural agricultural communities, foothills and beauty, and how you connect with that and reflect that in your own community, and farm to fork are all big. In terms of recommendations, I want to focus on these last two. So obviously, economic development, you want to go back to this thing that we talked about before from relationship. And in terms of valuing rural and nearby ag, I think you need to be careful. So you guys have essentially done a defensive incorporation because you want to preserve rural life within your town boundaries. But what happens if the county allows Roseville and Rockland to just spread all around you? Then you're going to be this really inauthentic rural community that is surrounded by a more suburban sprawl kind of landform. And so I think that you need to think about what are the tools you can use to preserve the very reason that you wanted to incorporate on a larger way around your city. And that is by looking first at possibly land trusts to preserve agricultural land in unincorporated county. Again, I'm going to go back to Marin County and Point Reyes Station. So this is a map of the Marin Agricultural Land Trust. So their land trust is focused just on protecting farmland in what is, you know, obviously some of the most valuable land that exists anywhere in the United States. And they estimate so far that they have preserved about 50% of the at-risk privately owned agricultural land in Marin County, which is amazing and really fantastic. And they pioneered, actually, when they formed this land trust, buying the development rights so that these things stay agricultural. And I want to say that there are two benefits to that. One of the reasons that there's so much value-added dairy work going on in this region is that the influx of cash that came in to buy the development rights helped them get into and pay for getting into things like cheese production. And so you want to be thinking about how you're not just preserving the agricultural lands on your edge and the rural lands on your edge, but how you're helping them get into value-added production that brings more money in the door, which helps to preserve them on an ongoing basis. So I think that the Malt Land Trust is really interesting, and kind of studying that whole agricultural economy that exists there still in a place that has very high land values is worth doing. You have a Placer Land Trust that exists already that's working on like beautiful, significant places and also agricultural places. So that would be a place that you could put a lot of energy and time and dollars into thinking about how to interconnect the kind of agricultural resources that still exist around Loomis, so you don't just become a rural island. And the second thing are growth boundaries, which I just wanted to talk about because they're what we use in Oregon to preserve agricultural land. So I at the beginning of my presentation talked about Canby, the garden spot, and this was a picture from their downtown. So if you zoom out in the map, most Oregon towns look like this. Every Oregon town and city has to have an urban growth boundary, and that means that the town is enclosed within a boundary and there's a hard edge, and then boom, you're right on rural. So if you look at this, it means that density, in whatever form density, is for your community, the most dense things happen in the center. Whatever your typical town density happens up to the edges. And then generally you have exclusive farm use beyond that. And I'm kind of really oversimplifying it, but actually Robert Liberty is going to be working with you guys and talking about housing. He worked for a long time with the group that helped to put forward and pass and get the urban growth boundaries to preserve agricultural land passed and implemented in Oregon. So he has a lot more information on that than my imperfect explanation. So it's a very quick review of the story framework. I just want to close now with a couple of thoughts on resiliency, which is a way that I like to think about planning and to talk about communities rather than some of the typical words that we use. And so what do I mean by resiliency? Well, like all things, I'm going to start with a story because I tell a lot of stories and this is about story. And the reason I now like to think about resiliency for everything, planning, economic development, marketing and branding, housing, all of these things, is something that happened to me personally years ago. So I had a doctor's appointment and a snowstorm came through and hit Portland, and they ended up closing all the roads. So I went into my appointment, and it happened to be a doctor's appointment where I was going to have some blood drawn. And the doctor said, well, I'm sorry, we can't do that test. And we can't do that test because all the doctors who can still afford to live in the city, they just walked to work and made it into the office. And all of our other staff, including the phlebotomist, could not make it in because they live so far away now. And it really made me think, what happens to our hospitals when we have some sort of natural disaster that disrupts roads here, like an earthquake, which is totally going to happen, if the only people that can make it into the hospital are the doctors? Because that's not good, because the hospital runs on a whole host of other people. And it really made me realize and think more deeply about the fact that it's not very resilient of us to have communities where, and this is my new metric, your phlebotomist cannot afford to live near where they work. And so that idea of resiliency and how we weave that into our economic development and planning goals, I think are a really interesting way to think about the kinds of questions that you're grappling with. So how do you create a resilient and sustainable resource economy? And that might mean extraction, like logging and fiction. It might mean agriculture and growing. How do you do those things? If a large part of your economy is based on resource extraction or growth, then you should be focused on sustainable practices that will keep that there as long as possible, like selective logging or approaches to agriculture that incorporate soil and water preservation. But you should also be thinking about how you're creating value-added products from extraction. So for example, the gold mines that all surround Elko are kind of interesting and drive a lot of the economy, but they don't have a single thing for value added with gold. They don't do any research. They don't do any outreach in terms of how gold is used for art or science or industry. There's nothing that happens in that regional mining specialty education that happens there around the use of gold. That is a missed opportunity to build up a whole new set of resources around, for instance, an extraction economy. If your housing policy means that the majority of your residents are 55 or older, then your commercial districts are going to suffer. And your peak consumption years, the reason for that is your peak consumption years are between your 20s and your 40s. And so the big way to think about this is, like, let's say you're a 55-year-old guy, right? You don't have as much hair, you don't use as much shampoo, you don't pick up diapers on the way home, and you have as much furniture as you need. You do not consume as much. And so one of the reasons we want to think about housing that attracts a wider mix of people is to have really healthy and thriving commercial districts that offer that wide mix of things, not just an expensive glass of wine, which is what people might spend money on. Then you need to have a mix of consumers in your community. If you want a more diversified and stable local economy that can weather ups and downs, you really have to avoid mono use. Because if something happens to that mono use, then everything around it dies. So if you're a tourist economy, like the Ojai example, you have to invest in offerings for locals, because the locals are ones that are going to tide you over when the tourists aren't coming. If you are a place that has just one company, you're a company town, you have to think about how you're incubating new firms who can replace that company if it decides to leave. And if your tax base is dependent on something like a large regional mall, you're going to have to think about what you're going to do to replace that tax base if the mall, maybe when the mall dies, because malls are kind of all, regional malls are dying everywhere. So ideally you do that sort of in advance of that. And then lastly, thinking about how you're growing your own companies. I'm a big fan of economic gardening. So if you're a bedroom community and everyone leaves for work, how are you going to create more opportunities for a resilient community where people live near where they work? Carmel, Indiana is a very high income suburb, and they actually used higher quality multifamily rental housing as a way to attract younger people who would engage in tech startups and software startups to diversify the types of white collar jobs that were available in that community. So how are you using all the tools that are in your toolkit to create a resilient economy, a thing that can withstand something like a pandemic? So those are all ways to think about these questions of who is Loomis and what does Loomis want to be, that might help you step away from some of the more charged and challenging words that have come up in the past. So that is the end of what I wanted to share today. I know it was a lot of information, and I know that Robert and Local Government Commission and Anders and Christy and everyone's here to answer questions about the master planning process or about work that's going to be going forward, or I'm happy to answer questions. And Greg, I imagine you're, I don't know if anybody's taken any, I've not been following chat because otherwise it's distraction, but is there anything that came up in chat that we should take a look at?
No, the one thing was, let's see, the new mayor, I believe she likes the Cowboy Creamery. The Cowboy Creamery.
Isn't it great? I know it's some of my favorite cheese.
And there was another comment that the LBB marketplace is going away and will become an extension of the LBB gastropub.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Such a great use. So, actually, I've been really impressed with the pivoting and the stuff that, you guys got into outdoor seating. They took over the subway. They filled a market niche at the time. Now it's going to move into more seating. That's all fantastic. And that idea of being flexible and resilient. I do a lot of real estate development consulting, usually a little bit more on the commercial and mixed use side. And I just cannot stress like what I say all the time: flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. We have to create infrastructure that allows people to be resilient, to be able to pivot in these markets. And so what's interesting is that these smaller kinds of buildings are really flexible. This historic infrastructure on your main street has really allowed the incredible entrepreneurial spirit of your community to pivot and to be very resilient. So some really great stories coming out of that.
So a question that came up in chat is, what would your tagline be for us?
So that's a hard one, and I'm not, and that was not specifically the purpose of this work, and that's something that I think that you have to dive into a little more. I think with marketing and branding, so a small town is like a big family. We kind of talked about this before in the workshops a little bit. I think that there are a lot of small towns that have a tagline that has some, connection to family in it. I don't know that tagline tells me something really distinct about Loomis. If I wanted to use it as a tagline, one of the things that I might think about is how are we manifesting that tagline in some way that is, so rather than the question of what would the tagline be, maybe the question is, what would you do with Loomis to make that tagline, really true today and really true in the future? Maybe that's a question. In terms of developing kind of marketing and branding taglines, I usually like to think of them not as being just one tagline. So I like to think about what is a tagline you might use for business recruitment? What is a tagline you would use for tourism? What is a tagline you might use, a little more internally for the community to represent itself? And so themes that you pull out you want to be authentic. I think that's the big connection. And Kayla, you're on the call. What was you had an example. What was the one from the community you were in that they had? I think Kayla, you said there was a series of small taglines that you guys would informally use. What was that?
Oh, I'm trying to jog my memory.
I know, they were good. So
I think it was Cleveland, Ohio. They have,
okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't quite remember. I'll have to search.
If you think about it while we're talking, pop back in. So yeah, so I think the big thing for me, I mean, taglines, to create a truly good tagline in and of itself, you have to really work backward, like I talked about in the workshop, from what are you using it for? What do you want to do with it? What is it meant to do? And that was not specifically the purpose of this work, but the things you do want to do is have it be 100% authentic, or it does not work, whether it's for economic development or locals feeling good about the community. And so all of the things that are in this framework are meant to contribute to that idea of what are the things that are authentic about us, and are we kind of walking the walk on our tagline. And that's why in the workshops I use the example from Portland of the city that works. I mean, you know, it's bragging, it feels inauthentic whenever you encounter something that doesn't work, and it's not a reason why a visitor would ever want to visit the city, so I don't know why they have it. So there's a lot that goes into developing a tagline that are kind of beyond specifically just this work. So I can't answer that in a really quick way, but I think things that are memorable and distinct about Loomis, those are the most effective ones.
We have a question from Gregory Obran. He's raising his hand, and then we have a couple more questions on the chat.
Okay.
So, Greg,
yeah, I wanted to ask about, is there any information that came through at all about how people want to live in terms of housing? Like, do they want, you know, some apartments, higher density, more high-end gated communities? What? I didn't get any of that from this.
So none of the questions were specifically asking what kind of housing people wanted. So people didn't really answer that question. I would say that there are a lot of hard feelings left over from the Villages conversation. And, you know, what's interesting is how much of it was really couched in that the Villages was somehow, you know, a personal affront to the small town values of Loomis. For a lot of people, this was a very personal conversation. And so I don't think that a lot of people didn't take that next step and say, if we have to add housing, here's how we would do it, or here's what it would look like, or here's what it would go. So that's the thing, is I think a lot of Loomis, you really frame things not in what do we want and how do we think about that. You frame things in terms of, well, we don't want that. But it doesn't like go to that next. So I would say there isn't a clear sense of that. I think there's just a really clear sense of, we want to hang on to our small town vibe. We don't want to feel like we're taken over by a bunch of people. And I think people have an ability to absorb change in smaller increments and smaller bites. So if you're going to take on projects, whatever kind of housing it is, I think doing it in smaller chunks is going to be easier for people to implement. But honestly, I think a lot of people haven't thought in depth, what does that mean? I would say your community is a little bit split. Like, people really value its blue collar past, and they recognize that property used to be a lot more affordable, and they don't really necessarily love on a broad scale that that's no longer true, but they like that their own personal property is worth a lot more, and they don't, you know, and they don't want to become Rockland or Roseville. I mean, there's this, that's sort of what drives everything. So I would say that there's not a clear sense of that. And those are part of the conversations that you're going to need to have. And that's why you need a new framework, and you need to start developing new ways of talking about these things that are working backward from what you want to see, and trying to separate out the emotion and the feeling that are coming out of objective and who you stand for and what you are, and how housing, I don't know, might reflect those things. I think you're just looking at housing from those perspectives, not of resiliency and of how human beings are using them and how it contributes to community. They're just looking at them in a lot line and building footprint kind of way. So I think there's just a more holistic way of looking at all these decisions. So I would say everyone's pretty far from that right now. And I don't know that they really know the answer to that question.
Yeah, that's a huge issue right now, because the Housing Element Committee is being formed, and they're going to start meeting. And it's been a difficult task all along, actually through the history of Loomis, among the Planning Commission, and we see this frequently. And you know, I'm concerned about it. And a lot of it's being, I don't want to use the word necessarily forced, but the state has a lot of regulations that's really pushing this issue. And we are going to have to bring the community together to communicate. And I was really impressed by the information you provided in terms of relationships, because I think you really hit the nail on the head on that. And that's a lot of the issue. And that's going to be the issue that's going to kind of really integrate with our housing element and where we go. And I kind of like your idea of, moving forward slowly, but, it does have to move. So anyway, thank you.
And we will be doing a workshop that SACOG sponsoring with the town in early 2021. Robert Liberty, who's on our call today, will be providing that educational workshop. Working with
I billed you as having the Santa hat, Robert.
Anders, you want to say something while Robert puts on his Santa hat? You went on mute, Anders.
You brought it up tonight somewhat, but I think you made a really strong point in previous conversations we've had, which is the town of Loomis so far has been reactive. And as we move forward with the general plan, we now have to be proactive. What do we want? How do we want it? How are we going to get there? So could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that mindset change from I don't want it to we have to move forward, and what do we want, and let's create what we want is really important in this process as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the big themes for me that you guys have to think about is that you're making decisions that are on a 50-year horizon, have this impact. But a lot of times we're just thinking about our piece of the pie and like a 2-year horizon. Like, I don't want construction next door, right? Like, so I think there's a challenge when you come from unincorporated county, defensive incorporation, like I talked about. So I think some of the big things for you guys moving forward and talking about like, what do you want is I think you need to think about resiliency. I think you need to think about the timeline that you're working on. Like, do we want to be a community in, Ojai is an interesting analogy to you guys in a lot of ways. Citrus farms, ag, they don't allow any national chains in their city limits. They're near a large influential economy, LA, you're near a large influential economy, the Bay Area has an outside influence in your community in a mix of different ways. Ojai has seen over time, their population has gotten much richer and much older, and their schools are all closing everywhere because there are no kids left that live in Ojai, right? That's what I'm talking about. Like, these are the 50-year ramifications of some of these decisions. So thinking about what you want your community to be over that timeline and how these puzzle pieces of economic development and housing and then your surrounding economy, how do those things fit together? I think that's kind of the secret sauce of coming up with a plan that makes sense and is going to get you to where you want to go. You have to really work hard to get off the, kind of that tomorrow timeline, or I hate this thing, or Rockland did this stuff to us yesterday. Like, none of that really matters, right? We're working on the timeline from today to 50 years from now. And putting those puzzle pieces together and really focusing on the humanity and on kind of the economics of a local rural economy, which can still be sophisticated and generate a lot in revenue. Those are the things that I think the community is really passionate about and needs to focus on.
We got at least 3 more questions in the chat. So next one is, with your suggestion of developing a civic framework for community decisions, can you offer some concrete examples?
So I think that, there's actually, there's the mayor of Charleston started Joseph P. Riley. He was the mayor for ever, like a million years. And he started this program at the National Endowment for the Arts called the Mayor's Institute of City Design. And it's because mayors come into towns and they're sort of the chief planner, but they don't know anything about land use. And it's meant to be this like really quick way of getting information and understanding sort of all of the components that go into land use. And he was so interesting. He said, in my city, we have a space that we devote just to talking about our city. and we make that civic engagement about who we are and what we want to be and where we go, that is just built into, you know, they invite people, they share information locally, like they do things constantly with that idea of, so that's an example of somebody who has created sort of the programming and even created space and dedicated space around that idea of constantly thinking about who we are and where are we going and what do we want. And he said something really beautiful once just about design in the public realm. And he said, you know, I care about how the public restroom looks at the park, because every single person who uses the park should appreciate and experience beauty in the trees, in the faucets, in the sink, in the, like, he's so passionate about design and how things looked and how things worked. So I think that's an example, like how making it a regular thing and finding ways, whether it's city clubs, whether it's getting leaders together in different communities, it's chambers hosting events. How do you start having these conversations? I think is the first way. The second way, or thing that you can think about incorporating into your process, is maybe getting outside help where you need it. So just like if your family has devolved into a giant knockdown, drag out argument, maybe it's helpful if the community is having a hard time focusing, bringing somebody in from the outside who can step you back. So the process of working through the plan, I mean, part of the reason you have people like Andres and Christy there is they're going to help you step back and say, here are some framework ways of looking at your long-term plan and transportation and housing and those kinds of things, or bringing in experts like LGC and like Robert to talk about these things. So I think in the early stages, your framework is going to evolve a little bit organically, and it's going to evolve from some sort of concrete thing that you start with. And that's why I like resiliency to be a piece of that, or to be something that you could launch from there. So I think that thinking about how you're using people in these early stages, because I think you guys really have to recognize you're in city kindergarten, right? You're just starting this. Winters has been doing this since 1898. So you have to really think about how can you get help. You have to recognize baby steps, you're doing it, and it's just the beginning. And you have to think about how you're starting to code this into being an everyday thing. So it's not just this thing where you get people together just to talk about a bridge project or a housing project or a general plan, but it's something that you're doing on an ongoing basis. So those are examples of things that people have done in the past, or ways that I think you guys should think about it that will be helpful in the future.
Okay, next, there's a question in chat plus a response to it. Is there anything being done with the land next to High Hand? This is the space between the High Hand parking and Sarah College. So that's the question. And then there was a response to that. Nothing is currently being done with the land next to High Hand, the old mill property. The deal with Loomis Basin Brewing and High Hand fell through, so the property is still being owned by the town of Loomis. Does Mary Beth or anybody want to add any color commentary to that?
Yes, that comment is correct. The response is correct, that there was a project with Loomis Basin Brewery and High Hand Nursery that was proposed during the town solicited a request for proposals, and that was a development purchase response. So the town will be putting out a new RFP this next year and redo that to see what kind of exciting things can happen there.
That's exciting.
Anybody else have comments on that? Okay, here's the last comment / question. Need advice on how to protect farmland when the goal of Placer County is to develop land. We don't want Loomis to be an island. How does Loomis and its neighbors like Lincoln understand that growth boundaries are good things, ? Oregon has growth boundaries for 30-ish years. It's actually in the 70s when that happened, so it's 50 years now. The Placer County Conservation Plan is counter to community growth boundaries. It is not pro-agricultural. It is not a pro-agriculture year, man. It's pro-developer.
So I'm actually going to let Robert talk about that for a second, but I wanted to say something first, and then I'm going to ask Robert Liberty a little bit of a question about that. So I think one of the challenges, or one of the interesting things about California counties is how urbanized a lot of them are. So I think even in Sacramento County, and I don't know the exact numbers, but Greg, what I remember is that like 50% of your population lives in unincorporated county, not in incorporated towns, roughly, in Sacramento. Is that roughly true?
In Sacramento County?
In Sacramento County, yeah.
In Sacramento County, yeah.
Yeah, I remember back when I was...
Sacramento County has more people than the city of Sacramento, but
right,
I think collectively the incorporated cities, Citrus Heights, Rancho Cordova, Folsom, I think is more than.
But it's still pretty close.
Sizable. It's probably 40% of.
Right, and so that's the thing that I think one of the fundamental challenges in California in general is that you have a lot of very essentially urbanized counties. And, you know, that's why I show the example of Esparto, which is an unincorporated county in Winters. I mean, honestly, counties are not really set up to deal with, you know, essentially the problems of populated areas, which are what cities are. And I think one of the essential problems that you have in California is just how much sprawl you have and how many counties you have managing what are essentially civic city-based services. So I think it's a really big challenge. And I think there are different ways of tackling the problem. And it really struck me as I was diving into the issues with Loomis and your incorporation originally and how people are approaching growth in the city is that, you know, you're kind of being assailed by a lack of this leadership on a county level. So you're trying to protect it from like inside the room, right? You've defined this line and you're like, well, we want to preserve that in here. And what we really need is bigger order thinking where we're thinking about how are we preserving that out here and creating dots of population that are manageable and kind of easy to control. So Robert, I would be curious just from all of your work with urban growth boundaries and agricultural land preservation, what some of your thoughts are, and you have so much knowledge about California as well. What are the challenges there from the perspective of people who are passionate about wanting to see that change within counties in California? Do you have any thoughts or recommendations around that line?
Well, Michele, you showed some Google images showing that there's a sharp separation between the towns and cities and the countryside in Oregon. You can see the same thing next door to Placer County in Yolo County. In fact, I had shown those images from Davis and Woodland, 4 other places in California, say this is what this looks like. Now, it's very hard to do on less than a large county basis, and it has to be coordinated with a strategy about using the land that you have within communities efficiently. By the way, I'm working on the same issue in Montana right now, which is experiencing an explosion of growth fueled by concerns about COVID-19. So thinking about the location of Loomis within the Sacramento region is you're closer to the edge. So there would have to be some recognition of an edge. This would be a pretty big undertaking, but it's something you could talk about with the county. The other thing to note is that agriculture is an industry. It's not just an amenity for people to look at. And California is a food basket, not just for the United States, but for a lot of the world. So your agriculture is really of global significance. So protecting it is very important. But the other side of that, and Michele knows what I'm going to say next, is that we use the land inside urban growth boundaries in Oregon more efficiently, which means we have more people, more jobs located within that land. That said, there's a lot of choices about how you do that. I think there's a lot of wisdom in the comment about taking it in incremental pieces, not in big chunks, which can seem overwhelming. And going back to the question about your identity and housing is thinking about this not in terms of what do the buildings look like, but what are the people who will be in those homes? What are they like? How do they fit into our identity as Loomis and what we want to be in the future? Because I know I'm drifting a long way from growth boundaries, but we have the same issues in Oregon. You can be a high amenity, high income, old community. And that's what can happen. And then it's not the same kind of place. So stopping housing may not stop change at all. In fact, you'll just get a different kind of change. And that's because you're in this economy that includes the Sacramento region and the Bay Area. So certainly believer in urban growth boundaries, believer in maintaining land and agricultural production and commercial production, and that it can be a great part of your identity in the future. but it has to be part of a bigger picture. And one part of that picture is if you're not going to use the land up for housing, then you need to use the land you already have in your city limits in a way that's, you know, efficient and thoughtful. But we're going to have a lot of opportunity to talk about ways to do that.
I think, you know, just to add on the urban growth boundary kind of thing, there are probably two big areas that I feel like there's a role for regional government and also maybe for smaller town leaders to kind of try and band together and create some collective political weight within their states. And so there are a million small towns in California, and every one of you has no weight, but collectively together, you have a lot of weight. And so if you want some things to change around how counties and how the state approaches agricultural land, and you have the benefit of being, you know, one of the biggest food producers in the world. And so agricultural land has so much value to your community and in so many ways, you know, economically, identity. It incorporates and has worked its fingers into like every part of your society. So I think there is a real basis for having those bigger conversations, and you have diminishing resources like water. But I think it's not going to happen in the scale that you want unless, you know, every small town pitches in $500 for a lobbyist and you start putting together an agenda and really going out and doing it. And those are the same things I've been advocating around the country now for 10 straight years. The three biggest problems in every small town in terms of downtown economic performance are out-of-town property owners, railroads, and state highways going through town, and the state highway department of transportation, because they control like the highway and the main street. And so I'm trying to get some state to get every small town to collectively hire a lobbyist to start to counter the freight lobby at their state departments of transportation. So we have some counter programming. So it's going to take those kinds of initiatives, because the challenge of being a small community is that, you know, as a single entity, you don't have the weight of a San Francisco or a San Diego. Nobody cares. But collectively, if you look at everyone that's represented by a small community, you know, you can play a leading charge in, we need to have a conversation about how we're creating sustainable, you know, agricultural communities. And we need to talk about this on a county and a statewide basis, and you sort of get everyone behind you, you have a lot more chance to move the dial on that. So it's harder to do individually, but it's got to start with someone. And in the meantime, definitely be looking to your land trust and studying the Maltz model from the Marin Agricultural Trust of buying up those rights and encouraging value-added production. So you're really embedding successful agricultural efforts happening around the region, because the more economically successful they are, the more likely they are to hang around.
And if I may, just to add to the comment about land conservancies, I looked at efforts to stop sprawl in all 50 states and regions and local governments. It's a gigantic report that no one's read except for my copy editor. But land conservancies can play a big role, but if they're integrated with the planning approach, their effectiveness is much greater. And it is possible to create an edge to your urban area using land conservancies, but it needs to be integrated. Otherwise, the tendency will just be to find easements scattered around. It actually doesn't preserve enough of the land to maintain the agricultural economy. So an integrated strategy working with the county and the city and land conservancies makes them much more effective.
Okay, we have a question.
Actually, I'm gonna add one more thing to that, and the economic challenge of this and the county hamster wheel. So I think the biggest challenge in California is it is sort of unintentionally made its counties municipal forms of government, even though they're not set up for that. So they have all of these expenses associated with running all of the services that go to these unincorporated county places, and they can't really afford it. So they're constantly thinking about, how do we develop new stuff to get new funds in the door to be able to pay? Like there's this, you know, sort of like a check kiting scheme. And so your counties are so deeply, like, you know, they have a heart attack when anybody thinks about incorporating, because it's going to take revenue out of their coffers, and they're barely making ends meet because they're trying to act as cities, even though they're not cities. And so that is just a larger conversation you need to have in your state, because honestly, it is not sustainable. You guys cannot keep that up. It is not possible for counties to operate as cities and manage all of those people the way that they're doing now. And it's kind of a fundamental flaw to the way that California has approached development. It's going to be a big problem on the horizon.
Hey,
Robert, they want a copy of your report.
Yeah.
Somebody's going to read it.
So Robert, we won't put you on the spot, but if you can get it to me, we will get it to the town and ask Mary Beth to somehow get it out to people or post it on the town website. Related to urban growth boundaries, there's a question about whether or not Winters has a urban growth boundary, and I'll take the first crack at that. What's going on is there's no state urban growth boundary law like there is in Oregon. With Yolo County jurisdictions, there's 4 cities there: West Sacramento, Woodland, Winters, and Davis. They all agreed that agriculture is key to that county, and they all agreed with county policies that preserving is important. So they have an agreement and policies in place to preserve ag lands, and lands that are in cities remain in cities, and they should be where housing is. And then the unincorporated area, for the most part, remains agricultural or related to agricultural, and really limiting the amount of residential that's in those areas. And if they are, if they're very contained. Go ahead,
I'm just going to share screen again. So if you look at this is Winters, and it looks a lot like Canby, right? There is a really clear line between the town and all of the surrounding. So you can kind of see the benefits of that. And it really put Yolo County definitely on the map for agritourism, and the perception of the value of agricultural products that come out of Yolo County is very high. So I think it's been pretty successful. But I would say, and Robert, I'm curious, I mean, my feeling though is that, you know, a community like Davis has not acknowledged that as housing needs have increased, that does mean though that you have to add more housing within, you know, the town. And again, you're going to really look at that central core where you have a small downtown district. How are you adding some housing into the central part of it? I mean, you can't just like not add housing anywhere.
Let's see, we got a follow-up question. Didn't Winters just vote that in for their town in the last election? I'm not familiar with that, but the person who wrote that, do you want to add anything about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. Anyway, any last questions for Michele? If not, we'll ask about next steps. So the comment is that there was a campaign called Keep Winters. So we'll look that up. Okay, so the town has an effort going on with both the housing element update, which we heard about, as well as the general plan update. Anders is the town's consultant. Do you want to, you and Christy and Matthew Gherkin was here earlier, or Mary Beth, any of you want to talk about what's next? Anders, you want to take a first cut?
Yeah, let me take the first cut. The town council has appointed a housing committee, and I believe at their next meeting, additional members will be appointed. It will be a committee of 11. The first meeting is Wednesday of the housing committee, which will kick off, and I believe there will be presentation on the law and the parameters around the housing element. And then the additional meetings for the housing committee will occur in January. Council will be appointing the other committee members for the other general plan committees at their first meeting in January, and then the meetings will start kicking off from there. On the town website, under the planning department page, there is something called the 2020 general plan. And on there, you have the existing general plan, and you also have revised sections of the general plan, including most of the setting sections. And we're recommending that anyone on a committee review all those, because there's a lot of good information. Michele shared some of that today, but there's more. There's a section on how to collaborate, so we're asking that the town collaborate with us. Actually, you'll notice a version number. Version O is the original. Version 1 is documents that have been modified. And actually, based on comments we've received from the community, the town glossary is now version 2 and has been updated to reflect those comments. So we're looking for people to review, provide input. Our finding is you can have all the technical studies in the world, but the community knows better their community than anyone else. And we want to incorporate that information into the setting sections, which form the basis then, as the committees will look at the general plan goals, policies. And the council's direction with the general plan is, basically they like to reaffirm the goals, policies, objectives, but really focus on the implementation. This goes back to the discussion I brought up earlier with Michele, is let's look at proactive. What are we going to do to make the town what we want to make it? So we're looking forward to getting into those discussions. So that's where we are in the process. We will be doing some surveys. There's a new tool we're looking at that you can actually plot on a map information. And so hopefully we'll know more about that, and hopefully we can release that in January so people can have even a greater interactive response to any of the issues that are coming up as part of the update. Thank you, Greg.
And I think to just like pile on again and sort of further follow up on the question and then what you just said, Anders, is and it follows up with what Robert said a little bit too, is it's really those ideas of really working backwards from, who do you want to live in your community? What kind of services do you want to offer in your community? What kind of economy do you want to have in your community? And it's not just cute downtown places where you can drink wine, but what kinds of businesses are in Loomis and around Loomis, and what do you want to succeed? You have to work backwards from those human questions and then think about how policy and planning applies to that and gets you to where you want to go. And unfortunately, too much in this process, what we do is we respond to a rendering of a house or a line drawing of a mixed use building somewhere, and everyone freaks out, and we don't have that conversation. And so I really think process is about thinking about who you are authentically, your story framework, and working backwards from those really human questions about, who do you want to live here? What do you, what kind of community do you want to be? And then how do you use these tools? Because these are all tools. And as Robert pointed out, like all of it, change is going to happen to you one way or another. And so the question is how do you use the tools that you have to become the community that you want to be?
Also adding to Anders, what he talked about on process, both Robert Liberty and the Local Government Commission have plans to provide a public workshop on street design as well as on housing options sometime in the first quarter of 2021, and we'll be working as part underneath the general plan housing element efforts. So this is tying in tonight's effort with the town's bigger efforts. So, and
I think that Robert will be also giving a quiz on his land conservancy report, and so he'll find out then who actually has read it. So be prepared.
To see if his copy editor shows up and wins the prize. So.
Cruel, they're all cruel.
Any final questions? Let's see. We will work with the town to get the recording on and any other resources to the town, and they can the town can post it on the website. Mary Beth, is there any final word you want to say closing for the town of Loomis tonight?
Overall and in general, I want to thank all the consultants on board, staff, town council, planning commissioners, and everybody for taking the time out of their evening. This was a great presentation, very, very helpful, and it helps us as staff and our consultants see the challenges ahead of us. So I'm looking forward. Thank you.
And I just want to say you're so well positioned. You guys have, so many arrows in your quiver in terms of directions you can go. I think it's really exciting, and I think you guys need to really embrace how exciting this conversation is. And it's going to be hard. We've seen in the answers with relationship. I mean, it's not going to be easy, but I think that I think it's going to be really interesting and engaging, and I think you guys have a lot of opportunities to shape a direction that is going to be really interesting and authentic for you.
Thank you, Michelle. So, and thank you for the comments that are written about this. So if I can ask the planning team to hold on, but the public wants to leave. Thank you so much for coming out tonight.